You know, the Charlottesville situation has lots of ramifications, and we check into the local take on that tonight.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
All righty, welcome in. Nice to have you aboard on this Thursday evening for yet another original show. There's, there's the nationally covered feedback and tumult that comes along with some of the things that happened in Charlottesville now a couple of weeks ago. And then there's the real life, on the ground type of stuff that you got to deal with. And, you know, there's a lot of, in some ways there's a lot of nonchalance, I think, over the idea that our Jewish community gets whacked around in these situations. And then there's those that, you know, overreact. And somewhere in the middle are the reasonable types that can discuss this on a, rational and educational basis, and I hope that we can do that this evening. There's always a conversation to be had about the Jewish community's everyday dealing with anti-Semitism, which, you know, we hear a lot about racial strife. That seems to get the headlines, but the anti-Semitic stuff sometimes gets pushed to the background, and I don't think that's necessarily correct, objective, or fair. I don't need to remind you about what happened a couple of weeks ago, right? So here's Donald Trump, and here's, of course, a headline about who was singled out in the Charlottesville situation, and Donald Trump suggesting that it's a multilateral problem.
I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either.
I don't know. We've seen it enough. I think people are probably nauseous over trying to react to the president's specific Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, in even this week type of thing. But in general, I think we ought to have a broader and then specific conversation about action plans here. Rabbi Sarah Mack is a revisitor to the program. It's great to have you. President of the Board of Rabbis here, and her vice president is Rabbi Barry Dollinger. Nice to have you. Welcome. Gut check on what we've been dealing with in the last couple of weeks is what?
The Jewish community is deeply disturbed. There's no doubt about it. Rabbi Dollinger would agree.
Whenever we see swastikas and Nazis, there's a visceral reaction, I think, for the Jewish community. There are many manifestations of anti-Semitism, some political, some, but when we see sort of neo-Nazis and Jews will not replace us in an old school vile anti-Semitism, it sort of engages a communal trauma for our community, I think.
All right, so are we in the middle of that right now? A communal trauma?
I think it resonates as such. There was a narrative written by the president of the synagogue in Charlottesville that was frightening, to say the least. That there was, hearing those chants outside synagogue during Shabbat morning prayers is not something you would ever think you would hear in the United States in 2017, and that's frightening to people.
Listen, I don't mean to dismiss your thought, but to suggest that it's not something that you hear in 2017, reasonable people would wish that you wouldn't.
You would hope.
But we have.
Like
but there's a reality out there that not everybody's on the same page, and in some ways, some folks I think have gone backwards. Yes.
So I think it's important to look at the sort of context for this. I think that's where I keep coming to it. There's a lot of trivializations that keep getting thrown about, and those are sort of important. But for me, there are, I think, two things that I sort of think about. One is the group nature of hate, how when people are sort of isolated from large groups, they don't feel empowered to do this sort of thing. And so not simply sort of calling people bad actors on one side, many sides, whatever. The whole conversation is silly from my perspective. What are the factors, the socioeconomic factors, the political factors that cause it? And the second thing that I sort of look at is global angst about the economy. Whenever the economy goes south and people are anxious, so they look for scapegoats, and Jews are an easy scapegoat. We've seen that throughout history. We're a go-to scapegoat for people and an easy return. And so I think the bigger conversation
scapegoat in bad economic times meaning what?
People are anxious about the fact that their jobs are being automated, that their manufacturing jobs don't exist anymore, and it's easy to, I think it's easy to blame other people or sort of rile people up and get them angry at the perceived people that have stolen their jobs. And I think that's where you get this Jews will not replace us sort of slogan that comes out of the Charlottesville March.
I never thought, Elaborate on that. Go ahead.
Well,
I mean, believe me, I recognize that dynamic of angst and the transitioning economy that we've had, and a lot of people who think that they had generational jobs still coming to them have, we're about 10 years out from that reality finally dawning on everybody that that's not necessarily going to be the case. I never calculated the Jews will not replace us as a relationship to that economic thing.
Well, I think historically anti-Semitism has been based in that, and I would say that xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism are kissing cousins. They're related, to the fear of the other, and anxiety in our times. I think it is really easy to go there. I think nationalism and populism also can invite that fear of the other. So I think there is a connection in that regard.
Well, it really is kind of. I must admit that when I hear the Jews will not replace us chant, I try to figure out as to what I have thought in my mind. What are they talking about? I mean, what grand plan do you people have to take over? And I always laugh out loud at the ridiculousness of it. And you're saying there's an economic tie. There's something there that's more than just imaginative. It's, in their minds, substantial.
I mean, if you look at like Weimar Germany, for example, that's like a good example, right? Post World War I, and Germany is feeling the economic crunch from sanctions placed on it after the war, and that becomes the very fertile ground for the most vicious and organized, systematic anti-Semitism that, or any kind of hatred, frankly, that the world ever sees, and we almost get exterminated. And I think it's that sort of anxiety, and we're an easy group because we're perceived as socioeconomically successful. We're perceived as a successful group, and people look at us and they say that inferior class with all of these stereotypes that we don't like, and maybe they don't have relationships with us, right? Maybe a lot of the people don't know so many Jews, and there's a history of sort of hatred, and they feel down, and so in order to prop themselves up, it's very easy to say, you Jews, and as Sarah was saying, Muslims, immigrants, whoever it is, it's easy to sort of just blame other people. And in my mind, all of those are really just a distraction from the fact that we have to deal with a really changing economy and a changing world.
I agree with you completely on that. Now, you mentioned something there which I feel some trepidation in actually going into, but since you kind of coughed it up, I'll follow up. This notion that Jews are perceived as successful and the like. And, I mean, is that a fair? I mean, obviously it's complimentary, but also there's a negative connotation that goes along with that as well. Yes? I mean, first of all, is that an accurate perception that you're reflecting on, or are you looking at it from a distance?
I mean, I think stereotype comes out of some version of reality, but I think that it's not always accurate. I mean, you have Jews who are in different socioeconomic strata, across the board, and I think that's maybe neglected when you only look at the stereotype, and that's true of any stereotype, I think, really.
Yeah, I don't. Do we have? I don't.
The Jewish community is very diverse,
I mean,
both socioeconomically,
right.
Racially. I mean, and ideologically. There's no one way to describe the Jewish community, both here in Rhode Island and across the world.
So your reflection on it, Rabbi, is more an observation on the observation, as opposed to a sanctioning of the legitimacy of the claim.
Yes, to be clear, right? So I guess two things, right? One, success often, I think, turns into a perception of greed. I think that's the hateful stereotype, right, of the greedy and perhaps stingy and perhaps uncharitable Jew. That's the ugly stereotype. And the Jewish Alliance here did a sort of study for their own purposes with Brandeis to sort of figure out what's the level of need in our community.
It's significant.
And it was, and what it turned out was basically the Jewish community in Rhode Island is statistically just like any other group in Rhode Island. There's no statistical variance between Jewish communities and
I mean,
any
you
other
raise
group.
money in your organizations for people who are needy, correct? I
Absolutely.
mean, it's not.
We have soup kitchens.
Yeah,
and
you run
homeless
soup kitchens. Not
individuals.
unlike every Protestant and Catholic church and every other denomination that's out there. You're doing things to help the community.
Absolutely.
Both within and without.
Absolutely.
There's a normalcy of that exists, and What you're saying is that the perception is that it may not very well be the case. Is that in part not that the neo-Nazis or anybody else who makes these accusations have an infinitesimal bit of credibility, but this perception thing, is it a challenge for you to be more, what, communicative, transparent, open about your own challenges, realities, common ground? No?
I think you're hitting on something, because I think one of the reasons that anti-Semitism really, until Charlottesville, hasn't gotten as much play, it's sort of like not talked about as much as racism. And racism's a really serious issue, both systemically in terms of the criminal justice system and in terms of all the police incidents. We don't need to get into all of that. The reason that the anti-Semitism, which is high numbers, isn't getting focused, I think in part this feeling, and maybe it's partially that by and large Jews are in a better position to deal with it, or there's some sense that it's real, but it's not as bad. I don't know. I think there's, right? It's a weird thing.
Well, I would say the Jewish community, unfortunately, has lived with security concerns for as long as we can remember. So, you know, without going into detail about our security measures, we've always had security
and we've talked about that
at services. We've always, right? And so I think it's at a different level now. I think there is more, it's more widespread just looking at the news than it ever has been before. That being said, I will say, you know, I feel very safe here in Providence, Rhode Island. I feel as though our local officials, our governor, the mayor, local public safety officials are very much in our court and looking out for our safety. And so, you know, that I think is heartening. And, you know, the anti-Semitism isn't prevalent, you know, beyond what you're seeing on the news. And that certainly, I think, makes me feel safer here. And so it's an odd juxtaposition, what you see on the news and how you feel living here in the state of Rhode Island.
And so when we come back, we'll talk about some developments. This relationship with the White House, not that good. Stay with us. So there's a little bit of tumult. I don't know, maybe it's an overstatement, that word, but there's kind of a new tradition that is being suspended here when it comes to the relationship with the presidency. Here's a headline that I think you got to take a look at. Rabbis forego annual high holidays, call with president over Trump's Charlottesville response. The history on this is what? It began with the president, with President Obama.
As a candidate, I believe it was initiated. And
by whom?
By the Reform movement. I believe Reform rabbis initiated that call, and then it continued throughout the Obama presidency when it was expanded to all of the American movements.
And the purpose of the call is?
The call was for the president to offer high holiday greetings, and many rabbis would write in questions, I believe.
And the high holidays, by the way, we've got Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur that come up in September, and there's 10 days between them, and there's a synchronicity to the two holidays. Mm-hmm. Rosh Hashanah being the New Year, right? Yom Kippur being the time for atonement, and in between that it's a reflective period of time. Correct?
Yes.
And was that an educational exercise? You know, there's a little, marketing a little bit to the world via the presidency about what's going on with the Jewish community in the country, and in the world.
I think there was also a candor to the calls, having called in
right.
for a couple of years in a row now. There was sort of more candor in the phone calls than you might have gotten in a prepared, official White House.
This call is what? Are we talking about a legitimate phone
conference call?
Just a conference call. Mm-hmm. But it's been postponed based on what happened in Charlottesville, correct?
I think more than postponed. I think it just is not happening this year, is my impression,
right.
Based on communications through my professional organization and my movement. Yeah.
So what's the background on that?
Well, there have been a number of statements put out, and I think the headlines cover them well. And that and this is the Reform or the conservative Reconstructionist rabbinical organizations have articulated that they are deeply distressed by the lack of moral tone to the president's response to Charlottesville, and do not feel the need to initiate this call, this high holidays, based upon what has transpired in the last 2 weeks.
And you're part of that.
I'm part of the Reform Rabbinic Organization, known as the Central Conference of American Rabbis.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And your group didn't necessarily buy in, correct?
So I'm part of the Rabbinical Council of America, an Orthodox umbrella group.
Right. The essential difference, by the way, sometimes people don't understand. You got 3 shows, right? Of course, but the Cliff's Notes in terms of your doctrinal, theological, sociological difference is?
Well, I would say that my movement does not consider itself a halachic movement. It does not adhere to Jewish law strictly. I think that's the nutshell version. I don't know.
And my movement sort of strictly adheres to Jewish laws. We believe it's sort of been traditionally passed down as a primary method of observance, and so.
Okay, you know what? Just do your own homework on that, because I'm fascinated by these kinds of conversations. If I get too deep into it, it will distract what I think is probably a commonality here, which is that this president ain't getting it done right now. Correct?
Yeah,
we share that.
But that your group didn't buy in is that you're not arguing.
So, right, I think, you know,
that's going to be an important distinction, correct?
Sociologically, many more Orthodox folks vote Republican. I think that's just a fact. The Orthodox community is. There were different studies, different segments, more or less split somewhere down the middle, so it's less politically liberal, I'm not judging them, I'm just describing, than other movements. And so I think it's harder for them. You know, they issued a condemnation of the president specifically post-Charlottesville, which was highly unusual for my group to do, especially a Republican president. It wasn't easy for them to do, and they were really appalled. And I think they feel like that was already hard enough to do, but they're not initiating a call, and there's no love for this president. You know, the use of language in Judaism, lashon hara, evil speech about someone, we believe is worse than killing someone, damaging reputations and speaking harshly about people. And this president has sort of made himself the king and champion of that. So,
wow,
not to do it in return.
Well, hoot, there it is. In lieu of officially exempting from the call, I think you more or less have punctuated your thought process on that. At press time, again, we always get caught up with Donald Trump in these things, right? We record the program earlier in the afternoon, and you see it at 7:30 on My Right TV and Fox Providence at midnight. All too many times over the last month or so, we've gotten to what we think is a current news default position with the president, then he does something in the afternoon and blows up the show. But as of press time, I don't think he has reacted to this yet.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yet. I wonder if he does. Predictions?
I'm going to guess not, but
yeah.
I mean, I don't think, I wouldn't expect it.
Is there something the president could say that you think would change this or just improve the dynamic? A heavy sigh, deep breath.
Look, you know, it is a time of introspection, and you know, if repentance is, I guess, fundamentally based on the idea that people, anyone, can change, and I guess I still hope and pray that this president.
Does repentance marry up with forgiveness?
It does, but you know what? True repentance, and this is true across the board in Judaism, means you not only say you're sorry, but you don't do it again. You change your actions and you don't repeat it. So you tell me. I'm not sure that that's likely. I would love to believe, have faith and hope in that.
I hope that there are a lot of people watching this show who think, well, that's how I brought up my kids. You know, it's got nothing to necessarily do with being Jewish. I mean, that seems like the morality of that seems to be a very common ground thing. You know, you know, prove it.
I mean, our class
don't do it again.
Repentance
right,
is
right.
You have regret, you admit, you confess what's wrong, and then you resolve to change in some actual.
But let's not kid
way.
ourselves. This guy absolutely believes that he has not stepped in it. And that's, you know what? Why don't we break here? We'll come back. We'll talk about that because, you know, all the protests in the world, if a guy doesn't think he did anything. What's the net value? Stay with us. So you got this beauty too, along with a headline from the national newspaper. Holocaust Memorial in Boston is vandalized for the second time this summer. We've talked about this before, Sarah. It's like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. You draw attention to the acts of one idiot.
Right.
It ends up becoming a national conversation. At the same time, if you ignore it, it's a kind of thing that perpetuates itself. I don't know what the answers are. It's another deep sigh and a deep, heavy breath. Take on this piece of news. Is it important to ring out, or just kind of say, eh?
I think it is important to ring out because of the fact that evil always sort of works in a group. It's not that people are born evil, right? There are people who have day jobs and families who choose to do something, and passive inaction on the part of the public, I think sends a signal to other people who are on the fence that, oh, you can do this sort of thing. And so I think it's not trite, it's not counterproductive to march, to call it out. And it seems crazy the amount we need to do it these days. And there have been swastikas in Rhode Island, and there have been vandalizations of synagogues and mosques and many other places. But I think it is important not to become immune to that sort of hatred.
Well, I think that the thing is that the super majority of the community is just kind of like, what? Really? Yet, if that's all you say, or if that's your only reaction, it's not helpful, right? So I get that. I mean, the infinitesimal part of the population that wants to perpetuate this kind of angst is just not worthy, I think, a lot of our breath. At the same time, I don't walk in your shoes, and you got to be able to be empathetic enough to understand that somebody walks in another pair of shoes has a point of view that needs to be heard, and maybe the rest of the community has to be a little bit more than nonchalant about it, right? Or discount it.
We, as Barry said, this has happened a lot lately, a lot more than it ever has before, certainly in my professional career.
And you feel it's all tied into this campaign and this presidency?
I think it has been,
the
tone has been legitimized. And I think, you know, when it's not condemned from leadership, when there's a kind of moral ambiguity, and there is no such thing.
So
hate is not okay.
So
it's not acceptable, and it does need to be condemned. I think you're right. At the same time, you could, you know, you don't want to, you know, to call out each and every one of these gets ridiculous after a while.
It's hard. I asked the question prior to the break about, you know, if the tree doesn't make any noise because no one, I mean, like Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand he's got a problem, so you guys just keep banging away. I guess you educate around him and hopefully he gets through. Lexi made a good point during the break. You know, you got the Kushners in there. Is that a plus? Is there a consciousness of this kind of conversation? What's your guess? I mean, certainly you don't know, but.
Right. So I mean, right. Jared Kushner is, you know, an identifiable and observant Jew, as is Ivanka Trump, and the many other Jews in the administration, Gary Cohn, other people who, you know, there are media reports that
Cohn was reportedly very upset about the press conference in Trump Tower. You know, reportedly. So, what's your projection as to what the internal conversation in the White House is about these things?
Right. I mean, I feel like it's always unfair to sort of, you know, single out particular Jews for their Jewish identity and say the hopes of our community are riding
That's a good point.
On you. On the other hand, I do hope that, you know, if they're concerned about these things, and they should be, that they use any power they have.
Well, it'd be interesting.
Because we can't speak to Donald Trump.
On that level, it'd be interesting to see if Jared or Ivanka say, hey, Dad, by the way, you're not getting this call this year for a reason. Yeah. You know?
I think there's a vacuum of moral leadership, and it would be lovely to see it come from someone. I think that's really missing.
Good visit. Appreciate it. Thanks for the education.
Thank you.
Final word when we come back. Stay with us. So that was an important conversation, no doubt. Tomorrow night, not really. You want to know a little bit more about how you do your fantasy football thing? We're preempted at 7:30 for football because, anyway, it's on MyRI TV, the football is. But we'll be there at midnight tomorrow night with Gresh and Yanni Karakis to talk about how to fill out your fantasy football teams. That'll be fun. See you on the Radio 3 tomorrow on WPRO. Bye.